Most entrepreneurs believe protection starts when the paperwork is filed. They believe once the documents exist, liability moves away from them personally and onto the business. The belief feels reasonable. It's also the reason why many people are shocked when protection disappears at the exact moment they expect it to work. In this episode, I'm going to explain why paperwork feels protective and why institutions never treat it that way. Paperwork feels powerful because it's visible. You can point to it, reference it, show it to other folks, then place it back into the proverbial manila folder. It creates the feeling that something was handled. We trust things that we can see, but institutions don't. Institutions trust consistency. And when I say institutions, I'm not talking about one agency, one regulator, or one bank. I mean any system that has to decide whether to trust your business without knowing you personally. Banks, courts, investors, underwriters, regulators, different rules, same question. Does the business operate independently of the owner, or is the owner still the business? Paperwork doesn't create consistency, it documents it if it already exists. And that difference is the entire episode. When entrepreneurs file documents, they're nothing more than an emotional contract with the system. They believe I did what I was supposed to do, I followed the rules, I checked the box. Well, that emotional contract creates personal confidence. But institutions never agreed to that contract. They never promised protection in exchange for filing. They promised the recognition, conditional recognition, based upon how the business actually operates. And that condition is almost never understood up front. Law doesn't create protection. The law requires behavior. Let's say that again, because it's important. The law doesn't create protection. It requires behavior. And if behavior doesn't change upon filing, then paperwork has nothing to protect. The mistaken belief survives because nothing challenges it. At first, anyway. You can operate for years without scrutiny. You can grow. You can sign, you can generate revenue. Comfort delays contradiction. Institutions don't interrupt success to test theory. They wait until something breaks. You heard the old saying, I had an LLC. How did this happen? Well, it didn't happen suddenly, but it was revealed suddenly. And most people believe that law acts as like a barrier. File this, sign that, and the risk stays on the other side. But institutions treat law totally differently. They treat it like it's a receipt. And a receipt shows what happened. It doesn't prevent the transaction. Paperwork shows that decisions were made, but it doesn't create protection if the decisions never supported it. Paperwork feels like protection because it's the last thing you do. But institutions don't start at the end. They start at behavior. In the next section, we'll look at what law actually does and why it was never designed to save you from the way your business actually operates. Most people think that law is preventative. They believe law exists to stop bad outcomes from happening. Institutions don't use law that way. They use law as a record. This section explains what law is designed to capture, why it's passive by nature, and why relying on it for protection misunderstands the role of law entirely. Law functions as institutional memory. It records what was decided, who decided it, when it happened, and how it was expressed. That's it. Law doesn't supervise or correct behavior, nor does it substitute for behavior. Law preserves the evidence of behavior, and that distinction matters more than people realize. Because when institutions review law, they aren't asking what should have happened. They're asking what did happen. Law always looks backward. Even when it feels forward-looking, it isn't. A document signed today doesn't control tomorrow's behavior. It simply documents today's decision. So if tomorrow contradicts today's decision, the document doesn't stop the contradiction. It just records that a contradiction existed. And this is why institutions never treat paperwork as protection. Protection would require enforcement in real time. The law doesn't operate in real time, but institutions do. And paperwork never overrides reality. It only records it. So once that clicks, most of the confusion is going to disappear. Long legal form records recognition. It allows institutions to categorize activity. It allows systems to interact predictably. It allows obligations to be traced, but it doesn't enforce separation by itself. If form and behavior align, protection appears to exist. If form and behavior conflict, the form is going to be ignored. Not invalidated, ignored. Because institutions can't rely on symbols when there are outcomes at stake. At formation, there's no pushback. There's no counterparty, no stress, no review. So people assume the paperwork worked. But the paperwork doesn't work on its own. It sits. And the sitting part feels like safety until something moves. That's why people experience law as disappearing when they need it most. It didn't disappear. It was never activated. Law was never meant to replace discipline. It was never meant to override behavior or to fix inconsistency. It was meant to record. Institutions expect the system to operate independently. Law exists to explain what that system did. When those expectations are reversed, disappointment becomes inevitable. If you expect law to protect you from your own behavior, it's going to fail you every single time. Not because it's broken, because it was never designed to do that. In the next section, we're going to look at when paperwork is ignored without being invalidated, and why that distinction confuses people even more than the failure itself. One of the most confusing moments for entrepreneurs is this. Their paperwork is never declared invalid. No one says it was wrong. No one says that it doesn't exist. And yet, it doesn't protect you. Well, this section explains how paperwork can be perfectly valid and still irrelevant, and why institutions do this without apology or explanation. Invalid means something was done incorrectly. Irrelevant means it no longer matters. Institutions are far more likely to treat paperwork as irrelevant than invalid. And here's why. Because invalidation requires argument. Irrelevance requires comparison. So, if behavior contradicts the documents, the institutions don't need to fight with the paperwork. They simply stop relying on it. The choice is quiet, but it's devastating for people who assumed protection was automatic. From the entrepreneur's perspective, it feels like betrayal. They say, I followed the rules. I got the documents. Yet, they're ignoring my structure. From the institution's perspective, nothing dramatic is happening. They're asking one question. Which source is more reliable? The document or the behavior? If behavior contradicts the document consistently, the document loses authority. Not legally, but practically. And institutions always choose practicality. Validity doesn't guarantee relevance. That's a big statement. That's a very big statement. Validity does not guarantee relevance. And this explains most of the how did this happen moments. Institutions don't announce when paperwork becomes irrelevant. There's no memo, no warning. Because from their perspective, nothing changed. They're still relying on the most accurate representation of reality. Behavior simply became clearer than the documents. Institutions prefer consistency. And this feels like a trick because people believe paperwork locks in protection. They believe once the documents exist, the system has to honor them. But institutions never made that promise. They promised recognition, conditioned on consistency. And when consistency disappears, recognition fades. Not out of punishment, out of risk management. Most people realize paperwork has become irrelevant only after a consequence appears. Maybe a denial, a freeze, a requirement for personal involvement, a loss of assumed protection. By then, the institution has already moved on. They're no longer debating structure. They're managing exposure. Paperwork doesn't stop working. It just stops mattering. And when it stops mattering, no amount of explanation is going to bring it back. In the next section, we'll look at why compliance feels like protection and why that belief collapses the moment pressure appears. Most entrepreneurs believe compliance equals safety. They believe that following the rules, filing on time, and doing what's required creates a shield around their activity. Compliance feels reassuring because it's measurable. You can check it off. You can prove it. You can show it. But institutions Don't confuse compliance with protection. Compliance answers only one question. And that question is, did you meet the minimum requirements to participate in the system? It doesn't answer whether the system is going to protect you when something goes wrong. And this is where many people misunderstand what compliance is actually about. Compliant exists to make you legible or recognizable to institutions. It doesn't exist to make you safe from yourself, and that distinction matters. You can be fully compliant and still be exposed. You can follow every rule and still carry personal liability. And you can file everything correctly and still be treated as the business. Because compliance doesn't alter behavior. It documents adherence. And institutions assume compliance by default. They don't reward it with insulation. They require compliance to even engage with you. That's why compliance feels like protection until pressure shows up. Under pressure, institutions stop asking whether you complied or not. They ask whether the structure actually functioned. And compliance doesn't have an answer for that. Compliance doesn't move authority. Compliance doesn't change control. And compliance doesn't reassign responsibility. It simply proves you were allowed to operate. When pressure appears, institutions don't punish non-compliance first. They assess exposure first. And exposure is behavioral. That's why people are shocked. They say, but I did everything right. Institutions reply silently. You did what was required to enter the system, not what was necessary to separate yourself from it. Compliance is the floor. Protection is a different conversation altogether. And when something breaks, institutions don't argue. They reconstruct. They take the outcome and work backward. They ask, who acted? Who decided? Who intervened? Who absorbed consequence? They don't start with documents. They start with events. Paperwork is introduced later as supporting evidence, but never as the foundation. And this is why people feel unheard during disputes. They keep presenting documents, but institutions keep examining behavior. Both sides think they're being logical, but only one side is reconstructing reality. Institutions assume the outcome already happened. Their job is to explain how it happened. An explanation requires causality. What caused it? How did it happen? Not paperwork. They trace authority through actions. They trace control through money. And they trace responsibility through obligation. Documents are useful only if they align with what actually occurred. If they don't, they're set aside quietly, not attacked, not dismissed angrily, simply excluded from the explanation. And this is why late documentation fails and why after the fact clarification doesn't work and why people feel like the rules changed. But they didn't. You just misunderstood when the rules mattered. Institutions don't determine liability prospectively. They determine it retrospectively. Once the story is reconstructed, the classification is obvious to them. Separate or personal. And that clarification governs everything that follows. There is a moment when law stops being something people lean on and becomes something that describes what already happened. And most entrepreneurs never realize when that moment occurs. They think law is still active. They think it's still protecting. They think it's still available to intervene. It isn't. And that point, law is no longer a shield. It's a narrative record. It explains how authority operated. It explains how decisions were made. It explains who stood behind outcomes. This is why people experience law as cold. It doesn't argue. It doesn't reassure. It doesn't correct. It records. By the time law is invoked under pressure, protection has already succeeded or failed. Law doesn't rescue structure, it explains it. And that's the part most people never hear. They assume that law is dynamic. Institutions treat it as archival or meant to preserve the record. If behavior aligned with separation, law supports that reality. If behavior contradicted separation, law documents the contradiction. Either way, law is not deciding. Behavior already did. That's the truth this episode exists to explain. Paperwork didn't protect you because it was never designed to. It was designed to remember what you did. And institutions rely on memory far more than promises. This episode wasn't about filings. It wasn't about compliance. It wasn't about documents. It was about expectation. And if you expected paperwork to protect you from how your business actually operates, then disappointment was inevitable. Because institutions don't use law as a shield. They use it as a record. Protection comes from behavior that makes sense under scrutiny. Law simply explains whether that behavior existed. If it did, paperwork aligns. If it didn't, paperwork fades. That's not a failure. That's design. And once you understand that, confusion disappears. The law didn't betray you. It did exactly what it was built to do. It remembered. Thank you for joining the Prosapreneur Network.